So Donald Trump Jr. just appeared before the January 6th committee investigating the insurrection, and he testified for a whole 2 hours. Do we really think Don Jr. told the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in just 2 hours? Let's talk about that, because justice matters. Hey all, Glenn Kushner here. So Donald Trump Jr. just appeared for some brief testimony before the House Select Committee investigating the attack on the Capitol, investigating the insurrection. Here is the new reporting from NBC News. Donald Trump Jr. testifies before House panel probing January 6th riot. And that article begins, Donald Trump Jr. testified before the House committee investigating last year's attack on the Capitol for, get this, 2 hours. Now, let's talk about some of what the J6 committee might have been interested in when questioning Lil Don Jr. I suspect there are two sort of broad topics. One is his father's conduct before January 6th, on January 6th, after January 6th, as it relates to his attempts to unconstitutionally, criminally overturn the results of the election, launching the attack on the Capitol on January 6th, and other related topics. And then I think the other area the J6 committee would be interested in is Don Jr.'s own conduct, his own potential culpability for, among other things, inciting the insurrection. But before we dig into those two topics that the J6 committee probably wanted to question Don Jr. about, let's remember, this is not Don Jr.'s first rodeo when it comes to testifying before congressional committees. Because remember, Don Jr. testified before a bipartisan Senate Intelligence Committee about all things Trump-Russia. And do you remember what happened after Don Jr. testified before the Senate Intel Committee? Well, here's the reporting from NBC News back then. Senate committee made criminal referral of Trump Jr., Bannon, Kushner, two others to federal prosecutors. You remember that? Here's how that article reads in part. The Republican and Democrat leaders of the Senate Intelligence Committee made criminal referrals of Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, Steve Bannon, Eric Prince, and Sam Clovis to federal prosecutors in 2019, passing along their suspicions that the men may have misled the committee during their testimony. So last time Don Jr. testified before Congress, before the Senate Intelligence Committee, he was referred to the Department of Justice for criminal investigation and possible prosecution for perjury. And he was referred by a bipartisan committee, Republicans and Democrats alike. Now, of course, that was when Donald Trump was in the Oval Office and it was Bill Barr's Department of Justice. So, of course, that Department of Justice under Bill Barr was where criminal referrals of Donald Trump's friends, family, and criminal associates went to die. Because Bill Barr wasn't going to prosecute Trump's family, friends, and criminal associates. Who would have thought in 2022, with Joe Biden in the White House and Merrick Garland as the Attorney General, who would have thought the Department of Justice would still be the place criminal referrals by Congress would go to languish, if not die, because here we are 142 days after Mark Meadows has been referred for criminal prosecution by Congress. The Department of Justice has not acted. Peter Navarro was referred for prosecution. Dan Scavino was referred for prosecution. Crickets. All hope is not lost there yet, but boy, are those criminal referrals languishing. So let's go back to Don Jr. and his current testimony. We don't know if he will be referred for criminal prosecution by Congress yet again, and if he is, whether DOJ will act. But the two topics that I think the J6 committee would have been interested in: one, what about his father's conduct before January 6th, on January 6th, after January 6th? Because remember, on January 6th, Don Jr. texted Mark Meadows, urging him to tell my father to call off the attack, to condemn the violence, to put a stop to it. So Don Jr. is one of those people trying to get his father to call off the attack, and his father wouldn't. He essentially waged war against the United States. But of course, when you're questioning Don Jr. about that, it sort of qualifies as irony. Why do I say that? Because Don Jr. was calling sending a message through Mark Meadows to his father, pleading, urging him to call off the attack that Don Jr. in part launched. Because remember, on January 6th, Don Jr. spoke at the rally on the Ellipse, the pre-insurrection pep rally. And Don Jr. told the angry mob, "You've got to fight." He led chants of "Fight for Trump." And he actually said that they should fight, and they have an opportunity today to be heroes. Today, that was the word he used. When somebody tells you to go down, fight today, be a hero, stop the steal, I don't know. It sort of sounds like he was urging the angry mob to go to the Capitol and fight today to stop the steal. So Don Jr., once things were clearly out of hand, out of control, officers being assaulted, the Capitol being breached, the crowd hunting for politicians, part of which was Don Jr.'s responsibility. Now he's telling his father, call off the attack, condemn the violence, make it stop. But I think that is one area of inquiry the J6 committee would have had for Don Jr. But there's another area of inquiry. Don Jr.'s own efforts to overturn the election's results. Because remember, we saw other texts that Don Jr. was sending to Mark Meadows before January 6th. This was actually November 5th, 2 days after the election, before the election was called, before the battleground states had tallied their votes. Don Jr. told Mark Meadows on November 5th, POTUS's second term must start now, before the election was called, before the battleground state tallies were even in. That is about as deeply un-American, undemocratic, and yes, treasonous a text as I can imagine. Treason in the layman's sense of the term, not strictly speaking the legal sense. He was saying, I don't care what the American voters have said. I don't care about the final tallies. I don't care that the election has not yet been called for anybody. Daddy's second term must start now. And remember, there were other texts by Don Jr. to Mark Meadows saying, we have total control. We have total leverage. We control all the pathways to the presidency. Really the only smart answer to any of the questions on those topics that Donald Trump Jr. could have given is, I hereby invoke my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination and decline to answer those questions. Maybe that's why little Don Jr. left the hearing after just 2 hours. Maybe he did invoke the fifth. Maybe he declined to answer questions. Maybe he conjured up some fake privileges, as other Trump loyalists have when they appeared before the J6 committee. But folks, what are the odds that Don Jr. told the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I would say the odds are slim to none, and slim is fading fast. But I will say this: if Don Jr. lied again before a congressional committee, well, he better be referred again to the Department of Justice for criminal investigation and possible prosecution. That will make him something of a frequent flyer on the perjury front. But even though Bill Barr's Department of Justice killed those criminal referrals previously of Don Jr., Jared Kushner, Steve Bannon, Eric Prince, and Sam Clovis, Congress will need to refer Don Jr. again for criminal prosecution if he lied in his brief appearance before the J6 committee. Because justice matters. Friends, as always, please stay safe, please stay tuned, and I look forward to talking with you all again tomorrow.